Since becoming a mom, I never understood why I was so eager to shut down my kids' meltdowns until I realized the root issue is that I shut down my own emotions. You see, it's not my child that I was responding to. It's the 8-year-old version of me that was punished for being emotionally honest and expressive. If you're like me in your mom life, easily overwhelmed, needing to control to feel safe, or feeling like your buttons are pushed at all times, you don't have to fix anyone or anything. What you really need is to meet the needs of that little child in you so that you can parent from a place of freedom and not the past. Hi, my name is Tian. I'm your mom friend of two littles who's trying to bring intentionality into motherhood and family life. If that sounds like you, please subscribe. Let's start with identifying what parenting from trauma could look like. Journaling, counseling, and mentorship all helped me identify these patterns that may be from a place of dysfunction. I struggle with having to make everything and every moment either teachable or productive. Just yesterday, my son and I were playing Legos, and he wants to build the best battleship in the whole world. While it was obvious that his objective is to spend time with me, I was all distracted by how do I teach him how to build the most structurally sound boat possible with Legos. And as a result, I wasn't able to actually enjoy the time I spent with him. Another pattern is that I needed control to feel safe. And in my mom life, it could show up as small as constantly cleaning up the space and environment because the physical mess is too honestly reflective of the mess I feel inside. It could also look like struggling to play the games that my kids propose and always wanting to orchestrate how my kids spend time with me. Now, there's a healthy degree to it, like bringing your kids into the things that you're already doing, but there also needs to be a balance where you enter their world. A cousin of this need to feel in control is overreacting to small things. For example, when my son and I would be baking together, if he makes some mistakes here and there, which is so normal for any human beings, if he spills something or if he put a tablespoon of baking powder instead of 1 teaspoon, I overreact. Rationally, I know it's not a big deal, but I overreact in the moment. Another one is something that I think most moms struggle with, some more than others, but I used to get really easily triggered by whining and crying, especially when it's for an extended period of time or that it happens a few times a day. I've gotten a little better over time, and I'm going to explain in the next section why. And once I feel overwhelmed, I shut down. And that shutdown could look like just checking out and needing my husband to step in. I need a moment to time myself out. Or it could look really subtle, like struggling to provide eye contact and struggling to listen without interrupting, or talking over your kids, giving them multiple instructions at the same time. I've also heard of others that people please their own children, and that could look like having very loose boundaries and wanting to keep peace at all costs and being conflict avoidant. I personally don't struggle with this one, but I've heard and observed that it's really common. These are all ways that parenting from trauma could look like, most of which I have personal experience with. You see, I made this video not because I got it figured out, but because I know the struggle is real and no one should feel alone doing this. You already did the hardest step, which is going from 0 to 1. If we want to tame something, we have to name it first. When you show up and do the hard work, this is extremely valuable for yourself as well as your family. And I am so proud of you for showing up. After recognizing the pattern, the next step is to identify what are the unmet needs from childhood. I've come to realize that the reason I struggle with making every moment productive and meaningful is because I had an unmet need to feel completely secure in who I am and not need to rely on productivity to prove my worth. You see, I went from being bullied and academically challenged as a kid to eventually being academically excellent and also being a leader. And I grew up in the Chinese educational system where academic achievement is the ultimate priority. But I did all that in order to earn my dad's approval. I managed to turn my academic situation around and I managed to earn my dad's approval. So in my head, I was convinced that my worth needs to be proven. It shows up in my own life as a way to stay constantly busy and productive and having multiple branches of tasks going on at the same time. So that unmet need of feeling completely secure in who I am is now affecting my motherhood. What looks like the need to be in control at all times and macromanaging was actually because I had the unmet need of feeling safe as a child. Growing up at home and at school, I experienced physical and emotional abuse at both places. And my single mom was always at work. I didn't have a father figure in my life. I had undiagnosed ADHD as a child and no one really understands me. I was an easy target of bullying. So now, as a grown-up, I could appear a little hyper-vigilant because as a kid, I constantly felt helpless and I had to activate this fighter in me in order to protect myself because no one else would. And I think that pain was so impactful that as a mom, I'd hate for my kids to have to go through that. So controlling feels safe, and I did it from a pattern of the past. So it now shows up in my motherhood as being hyper-vigilant and controlling and overreacting to small things. As I mentioned at the beginning of the video, I struggled to accept my kids' emotional expression, and their whining and crying can be an easy trigger for me, and it's not their fault. And looking back at my childhood, my parents weren't the most emotionally honest people themselves. They were very quick to shut down my feelings or any attempts to explain my perspectives. So I often felt misunderstood, and as a result, I just learned to suppress my emotions because I didn't think that anyone would care about it. Being able to accept someone else's emotional honesty starts actually with accepting my own emotions. Because I couldn't accept my own emotions, I don't know how to accept other people's emotions, including my kids. When God's words said, love your neighbors as yourself, which in another way is just love others as you love yourself, it actually starts with loving yourself. So when my need to be emotionally honest and be fully accepted is not met, it shows up in how I parent. I get easily triggered when they whine, when they cry, and it's not their fault. It's because I never knew what it's like to accept my own emotions. Now you might be thinking, how do I actually have those needs met and therefore be able to parent differently so that you can break the cycle of trauma and actually do something new? Staying curious and compassionately curious is the emphasis here. For the longest period of time, I tried to do the work of studying myself, my childhood, in hopes of breaking the cycle. But the kind of curiosity was more like, why am I like this? It's more condemning, right? Instead of being like, why? Why am I like this? It's more compassionate, and it's more from a place of genuinely loving yourself. If it's really, really hard for you to access that or have that compassionate curiosity, enlist people that love you. Enlist your spouse, your friends, your mentors, people who genuinely love you and care for you and know about your story. Sometimes our struggles are so obvious to other people, but not obvious to ourselves. They might see things that are destructive in our lives, but they may not feel like they have the permission and the green light to tell us. Invite those voices and ask them, knowing my story from the past, what do you think are some of the ways that I am parenting from a place of hurt instead of a place of freedom? After identifying the unmet need, that's where I get stuck. I made the mistake of giving the offenders way more empathy than I gave myself. If this is you, please let me know in the comments below. True story, one time I was telling my therapist something from my childhood. It was very painful, very hurtful memories. And she stopped me there one time. She said, Tian, you're telling me a horrible story from your childhood. Why are you smiling? I just froze right there and then. And I looked at my own face in the computer screen, and she was right. I was smiling. And I thought, how messed up is this? Why am I smiling? Like, my therapist is crying and I am smiling. And that's how little empathy I had for what I've experienced. As a child, I may have had to justify the offenders because I am actually fully dependent on them to provide for me, to love me, to give me any attention at all. And as a kid, when you're in that position, you're just stuck in that survival mode. And even as a grown-up, when your situation has completely changed, I find myself still stuck in that state of low empathy for what I've gone through. I wasn't actually admitting that those were hurtful and I had unmet needs. I know if I truly face what I've gone through, I run the risk of becoming resentful and bitter, and I didn't want to be that. But what I did not know is that being emotionally honest under the authority of a relationship with God will actually lead to freedom. It is not a sin to have feelings. This is completely news to me. In the last year or two, it finally clicked that having feelings is not a sin. It's what you do with the feelings that could be sinful. In Ephesians chapter 4:26, it says, be angry, but do not sin. It separates the feeling from the action that you choose to do in regards to that feeling. And God sees them as separate. He allows you to be angry. He created those emotions for good. But what you choose to do with that emotion could potentially hurt others and therefore be offensive to God. And if you read enough Psalms, which I started to do seriously this year, the authors often follow the pattern of naming what's wrong. They start ranting, seriously, a lot of ranting in Psalms, with much more civilized language than I would use. They could be naming abandonment, betrayal, attacks from the enemy, constant struggles, health issues, and then the author often questions God's care, goodness, and faithfulness. And the next stage is actually healings that come from remembering God's character and the encouragement and the comfort that they feel. Recognizing what is wrong and naming it and actually allowing yourself to go through that process of wrestling is the beginning of healing. After realizing that, I finally started having breakthroughs in moving on to the next stage, which is having those unmet needs met. I see this positive trend being coined as reparenting. In my case, it was less that I'm trying to meet those needs myself. It's more about accepting God's love and letting Him actually father me. I am not very reliable in terms of meeting my own needs. And if you're watching this video, you probably struggle with that to some extent as well. And I also can't put hope in my parents to change and to meet those needs. I would love that if they do, but I also know that it's not an expectation I should have on them because that is their life. The reason that I had to learn to accept God's love is because I had felt abandoned and rejected by my own dad at different stages in life. So it's extremely hard to believe that this Heavenly Father will actually not do the same. And it all starts with actually getting familiar with God's character through scriptures. It's actually learning to go through the entire Bible all at once. I think a lot of people, whether believers or not, would choose part of the Bible and just focus on that and call that God's character. But if we look at the entire text of the Bible, a lot of themes start emerging where you start to understand what does it mean for him to be all gracious but all just, and how does he strike that balance. I think a lot of God's character are being misinterpreted because we try to see it through our own lens, through our own experience of how we've been parented, when really he is a completely different parent. There is nothing like his fatherhood. And if I decide that I'm gonna get reparented by this God, I better get started on learning what his characters are actually like. When you start learning about the character of God, inevitably you start learning about what he says about you. I think a lot of us got it backwards. We feel like we have to figure out who we are and then we can learn about God, when really it's the other way around. Once you learn about God, you know how you're made, you know your maker, and you know who you are. In Victory Over the Darkness by Dr. Neil T. Anderson, there was a one-pager or two where he summarizes some of the things that God says about his children. And I made a list myself and I printed this out. It's actually a 3-pager of all the verses that I could find in the Bible where God tells us who we are. And I'm just gonna read you some examples. Instead of thinking that I was an accident, which I was actually born out of a wedlock, and I was totally a surprise. So during my childhood, I've been told by different sources that I was a burden and that my mom's life would have been better without me. But what God has said about me is that I was chosen. In Ephesians chapter 1, verse 5, it says he predestined us for adoption to sonship through Jesus Christ in accordance with his pleasure and will. And the verse before that, verse 4, says, for he chose us in him before the creation of the world to be holy and blameless in his sight. My existence is not an accident. As someone who always struggled with the lack of security, what God says about me is that fear is not my identity. Power, love, and a sound mind is. Growing up, I had a lot of shame about my identity, and it was shame piling upon shame because I continued to experience different kinds of abuse. But the truth is that Jesus is not ashamed to be associated with me. In Hebrews chapter 2, verse 11, it says, so now Jesus and the ones he made holy have the same Father. This is why Jesus is not ashamed to call them his brothers and sisters. And if this is something you want to print off yourself and be able to go through as well, I'm gonna link this printable down below. So instead of like me trying to reparent myself, I am more replacing what has been spoken over me with what God is now speaking over me. And a practical way that I experience healing in this relationship right now is actually starting with talking to God honestly. For the longest time in my prayer life, apart from listening to God, the things I speak to him, the petitions I make are mostly things that I think he's gonna enjoy listening to. The things that sound like most of the parts of the Bible that we like to read. Now, instead of praying the things that I think he'd like to hear, I am praying the things that are genuinely on my heart. That is how I start being emotionally honest with myself, is actually talking to God honestly. Another example is that when I have a problem, I have the habit of coming up with a plan A, B, and C, and then I take those 3 plans or something and go to God and pray about, hey God, what do you think about these 3 plans? But now what I'm doing is when I have a problem, I try to go to him first instead of trying to come up with options myself. This is actually reconditioning myself from the past where I feel like I have to come up with a solution because no one is looking out for me. Or if I come to my parents with just the questions without any proposed solutions or any evidence of me trying to solve it myself, then I am usually dismissed or called lazy. But that is not how God sees me. He actually delights in me depending on him, and that just breaks my brain. And I'll let you in on a secret. If you're anything like me, feeling like you've never really had a childhood and you had to grow up too soon, you really want to be like a child. You want to know what it's like to depend on God and to trust God, but you don't know where to start. Watch your children and learn from them. I am not even kidding. I am taking notes on my journal the other day. I was writing down a list of what was it? 13 characteristics of my kids and how they are behaving like children towards me. And as moms, we have the luxury of imitating our children in our relationship with God. In Matthew chapter 18, it says, truly I tell you, unless you change and become like little children, you will never enter the kingdom of heaven. I'm gonna quote my therapist that it's really magical, the fact that our little kids look like us, because interacting with my children is almost like interacting with a little version of me, and a great way to start practicing loving our our kids from a place of freedom is to actually let them remind us of ourselves. When you're giving your children grace, the grace that you've not been shown when you were a kid, it's almost like showing that little you some grace that they deserve. In order to make this process sustainable, and I constantly remind this to myself as well, it's important to engage your community, whether that's your spouse, your therapist, your friends, your mentors, and even me making this video is part of that process. It's part of sharing the struggles and not feel alone, but also putting it out there that this is what I'm working on and I need accountability. And if breaking generational cycle and parenting from a place of freedom, bringing intentionality into motherhood and family life is your thing, please be sure to subscribe because a lot more is coming. And I'll see you in the next video. Bye!